So this will be notes for Mark. First of all, overall, reading your paper, I was really impressed. I thought a lot of the ideas were well developed and well argued. These are just going to be some of my notes. Let's start from the beginning. The topic, I think we can word better. American roots music such as blues and jazz and how they came from African music. I think, first of all, we need to, I don't know, maybe just reorder the way that is just to make it a little bit clearer for the reader. So the table of contents looks good. One thing I just want to point out here, you've got work songs, and I think that's the correct title to be using throughout the paper. A couple times you switch between work songs and the Negro songs or Negro work songs. Really, we want to try to avoid that language as much as possible. They do say Negro spirituals in a lot of the literature, but let's just stick to work songs. I think it'll be easier. Okay, just looking at this, obviously some formatting issues. Where it says, I think the language in the abstract overall we could probably clean up a bit. Also be careful of using that terminology. Let's just keep it to work songs. I also see, like, we end up using the word stage quite a bit in there. Let's see if we could reword that maybe so that we're not using stage quite as much. Your research question looks a lot clearer than the topic that we had written before, so if we can maybe rewrite the topic more similar to this. Okay, so again, let's be careful of this kind of terminology. Here we don't want to end the sentence with by. It's just not good to end with a preposition. Yeah, in this part here, for further development, I think was worded a little bit strange. Maybe we could fix that up a bit. I think you got some good points in this. You can maybe even expand on it a little bit. Okay, so let's get into the body of your paper. So first of all, this first section here, I mean, that looks really nice, but it sounds like a quote, and if it is a quote, it needs to be documented as a quote, which brings up a kind of important part. I don't think we have a lot of in-text documentation, if any at all, except for just the visualizations. I think we need to check with Mrs. Wilson to check exactly what kind of documentation we need, or citation that we need, sorry. Okay, so this section of the body I really like a lot. I think there's a lot of great points in it. I mean, a couple things right off the bat. You've got some great ideas of how it wasn't written down, and it's an oral tradition. I think, you know, there's a couple language things that we could maybe clean up a bit, but especially here in this section here, I really like the fact that you're using a lot of musical terminology, because that is a big part of what it is that we're supposed to be looking at. And you show it really clearly with this figure here, which is nice. And I like your description of that figure too, which makes it a lot, it makes it very easy to see. One thing that I would say is we do have a saying, or sorry, you have some areas in this section here that is talking about call and response. We say that it was the most important of traditional African music. You might actually say why call and response was really important to traditional African music. So I think that this figure at the top of your page here, I think that's a really, really valuable visual representation of especially rhythm, but I think we could explain it a lot more in our text here, because I didn't get a huge amount of text. There is some citation finally, which is good, but we need to get more into that throughout the entire piece. Also, let's see. Yeah, this sentence here doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. The final stage dance as a result of all the previous stages. I mean, I understand what you're trying to say. I just think it could be worded a little bit better. As we move through the page. Um, I really like the section where you're talking about how the syllables and vocals change the meaning. I think that's really interesting. And also, I think it shows that you've done quite a bit of research, which is really valuable. And also, especially how, I think this is a key point that you could probably bring up even more, how the fact that it wasn't notated really kind of brought about the point that it was improvisational, and that improv became such a big part of that musical culture. I think you could probably even pull that into the forefront even more. And how the repetitiveness kind of made it necessary, like, for improvisation to be brought out into the forefront. So in the next paragraph, ending with had like that kind of sounds pretty strange. Let's see if we can rework that. I do like that you're using work songs more in this, and I like that you kind of point out the fact that Eastern Africa is different than Western Africa. It kind of shows that you're really making some connections there. And yeah, that looks pretty good. I do find it a little bit confusing that you start the work songs with the earliest form of blues. I mean, I understand that you're trying to show that they're related, but maybe say something that it's like a primitive form of the blues or something like that. I think it would make a little bit more sense. I like the description of where work songs came out of, especially the idea of the pickaxes and kind of the ways that came out. I think that's well researched. I especially like the way that you were talking about how the melody implies a harmony here, and especially that the melody is implying a 1/4 and a 5 chord. I think that really adds a lot to the paper. Also, as far as citation goes, if you were the one who transcribed that, then go ahead and write that down. If this came from somewhere else, make sure that you're citing it, because they're going to be looking for that kind of stuff, especially on the figures. But we really need to figure out what our entire citing system is going to be. I think this whole section here where you're talking about how we've got strong beats on 2 and 4, I think that should probably go into the jazz section, and you could probably bring a stronger correlation of how that was used in jazz a little bit more if you put that section in the jazz section, going back to the idea of a field holler, work song, instead of putting it in this section here. Yeah, overall though, I think this section is pretty well researched, and I like how it's written for the most part. Just be really careful that we don't end with prepositions at all, so just go through your entire piece and make sure that you don't have anything like that. This page looks pretty good. Again, citation, be really careful about. One thing I would say though is that dominant chords in the case of blues and African American tradition music, I'm not 100% sure that it's about tension, because it resolves back to a 1/7. So I think it's more like that's the feeling that they're creating by it. I mean, if you want to explain that as tension, that's fine, but I might just like maybe write that out explicitly so that it makes a little bit more sense. So I really like this visualization. I think it's really useful way to look at visualizing the blues. I think maybe we could describe it a little bit better here, but overall it's not bad. Be careful of the wording here, and I like how you go from minor pentatonic to the blues scale on the next page, which is useful. So yeah, again, I like how you moved through to the blues scale. This section I might actually put under the early jazz section, because you really do start getting into jazz here. Or you could maybe split this information up in two and put some of it before the early jazz heading and some below the early jazz heading. I think that'll help make a little bit more sense of that entire piece. But I really do like the beginning and the spot before early jazz. I think it makes or the beginning of early jazz. I think it makes a lot of sense, and you really introduce a lot of stuff that's going on there. So that's really good. Okay, so throughout this page, I think it's really great that you used a jazz 12-bar blues to introduce the beginning of jazz, because that's definitely where it came from. I also like that you're talking about the movements of 2-5-1 motion. You might want to talk about the thirds and the sevenths moving. If you take, for example, a look at D minor, which would be the thirds and the sevenths, which would be F natural, and the seventh would be C. And then if moving to a G7, then it would be B and F. Moving to a C major 7, which would be the last of a 2-5-1 progression, which would be E and B. And if you take a look at that movement, this only moves a half step down, that one stays the same, and then from G7 this only moves a half step down, and this stays the same, and which is really where that strength comes into it. And you might want to talk about that as far as like the progression goes, because that I think is a big difference. One thing that I do want to point out right here, especially this, I'm sure it was just a little bit of an accident, but it's kind of blue, not king of blue. And, you know, we're talking about modal jazz. I think this is kind of getting away from where we were going through with early jazz. So you might want to take that out, or at least, you know, kind of mention that, how it moved forward. So we don't want to bring that in too much. So here also is where you brought back that idea that we were talking about before of the accents on 2 and 4. I think if you just put it in here, it would probably make a lot more sense. Yeah, okay. So overall, with the conclusion, I'd really like to go through the guide, the EE guide, and really look at how we can make more arguments and like giving proof for our arguments. Also, again, careful of the terminology there. You have a couple arguments in here, especially about the rhythm. I think you could probably go a little bit more into improvisation. Again, another one that we're going to be a little bit careful about. Here you have jazz also most likely would not exist. I think it definitely would not exist, and you can be a little bit more forceful with your arguments. I think they're pretty useful. Yeah, I think overall, honestly, the paper was written really well. There's a couple of language issues that we have to be careful with. Besides that, I think it's looking pretty good. And when we're talking about the bibliography and the citation, I think we need to do a little bit more research into how to do that exactly. So let's talk to Mrs. Wilson, make sure that you make a note of that.